All right, hello everybody. Welcome back to the Popular Music Books and Process series, a joint project of the International Association for the Study of Popular Music, US chapter, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and the Pop Conference. I'm Elena Razlogova, one of the series organizers, along with Eric Weisbert, Carl Wilson, Gus Stadler, and Alex Visi. And Antonio Randolph will be rejoining us in the spring. You can find our entire calendar on IASPAM website under the Journal tab. You can also catch up on videos of all our past sessions on Eric's YouTube channel, including the sessions from 2 weeks ago with Steven Dusner and Stacey Easton on two failed country albums and the breakdown of celebrity. We will be off for the break, but then return on January 7 at an earlier time, 5 p.m. Eastern, with S.H. Fernando Jr. talking about his book, The Chronicles of Doom, Unraveling Rap's Masked Iconoclast. Today, Ashawnta Jackson is talking with Emily Lordi about her new book in the Bloomsbury 33 and the Third genre series about the emergence of a vibrant subgenre of soul folk and the artists who pioneered it. Let me give you some quick background on today's presenters. Ashawnta Jackson is a reader, writer, and record collector living in Brooklyn. Her work generally focuses on Black music, history, and culture. She's the author of Soul Folk, and she has also written for NPR Music, Oxford American, Wax Poetic, JSTOR Daily, Vinyl Me Please, and Bandcamp, among others. She's currently at work on her new book, A History of Black-Owned Record Labels, set for release in 2027 by Norton. Emily Lordi is a writer, professor, and critic. She published 3 books, Black Resonance, Donny Hathaway Live, and The Meaning of Soul. And she's now writing a biography of Whitney Houston that reassesses her genius and impact. Her profiles and essays appear in venues like The New Yorker Online and T, the New York Times Style magazine, where she's a writer at large. Since 2019, she has taught at Vanderbilt and lives in Nashville. During their conversation, please post your questions as you think of them in the chat. And in the last part of the session, Eric will call on you to unmute and ask them during the Q&A. And of course, we also encourage you to use the chat for comments and conversation. And the presenters will get these comments as a text file in the end of the session. However, we'll ask the presenters to ignore the chat during their discussion. We'll send them a copy of the chat later. And now I'm going to turn things over to Ashawnta and Emily. You're on.
Hi, Emily. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining, and especially to Emily for agreeing to be my conversation partner for this. As I mentioned earlier, I'm pretty nervous, but I'm told this is a really kind group of people, and, and I hope that that is true. I'm going to start off by reading the introduction to Soul Folk, just so we can all kind of be on the same page about the genre, and we'll go from there. I first heard Terry Collier as a sample, a haunting, nameless 30-second moment on a song by a British trip-hop band, Uncle. That voice, his voice, had buried itself into my brain. It was 1999. Physical media was still a thing, as were liner notes, so it was easy to find out it was Terry Collier, a name and voice that I'd never heard before, but one I couldn't get out of my mind. When I finally heard his 1972 album, What Color Is Love, I knew that a world was opening up for me. There was always something about folk music that felt so outside of my experience, so outside of my interests. But this man and his guitar, his voice, the quiet way some of the songs ached, this was for me. It was all the things that people tell you they love about folk music, but it reached into places that felt familiar to me. Terry Collier's voice would start me on a long and continuing journey into the world of Black folk music. Not music that leans into this staid idea of folk, not the familiar sounds of the collision of old ballads situated in a new land, but one that took its roots from the stories and sounds and history of Blackness. This music, soul folk, takes its cues from the long history of Black music in America. It's not a new genre by any means. In 1975, music journalist Roden Gibbs wrote about what was then a new trend of Black folk music. Citing artists like Terry Collier and Linda Lewis, Gibbs expressed his hope that this kind of hybrid, music that takes from the country blues, folk, soul, and jazz, would have a long run. But I'd take Gibbs's argument a step further. Rather than a new trend, soul folk is one of those things that has always been with us. And the way it emerged and reemerged over the years is as much a reclaiming as it is a subgenre. Black performers have long been involved in folk music, and this 1970s movement of Black folk is just another link in that history. I share Gibbs's hope and insistence that Black music in all its vivid spectrums would be seen, acknowledged, shared, cherished. But the big question this book will try to answer is, what exactly is soul folk anyway? Like any other part of music history, this subgenre has its roots and branches, its history and its pioneers. But the story of Black folk music is often obscured, its lineage subtly erased as the term folk became more associated with the white musicians taking it mainstream. And at the point where the notes become faded, the names become vague memories. That's where I want to begin. It starts with the spiritual, travels through enslavement, finds itself boxed into arbitrary genre lines, and ends up here, soul folk. Folk is rooted in tradition, and for Black performers to reach back into history for the traditions that shape the sounds of Black America, it wasn't necessarily going to be English folk tunes, though they did enter the picture. It was also going to be blues, jazz, spirituals. Artists like Terry Collier drew from jazz, R&B, and doo-wop to create his unique blend of sounds. There are the twisting, almost psychedelic ballads, the subtle reworkings of traditional folk songs that breathed new life into them, the funky songs that found him embraced by electronic musicians near the end of his life. Black folk music, or soul folk, has a long history and maybe, hopefully, a long future. But the many twists in the road take us back to the same place. Soul folk is the sound of lost and found, of displaced and at home, of creating something new out of age-old traditions. So yeah, for me, the idea of soul folk really began, as I mentioned, with Terry Collier, and he's kind of my North Star when it comes to this genre. He was the first sound that I heard that made me want to go chasing, to find more like that. And that's really how the book kind of unfolded. Kind of finding these artists that kind of felt like they were connected to one another, through this idea of, I don't want to say reimagining folk music, but reclaiming folk music and taking it to these places that felt familiar in community, but maybe unfamiliar outside.
That's wonderful. I really enjoyed the book. I appreciated the book, and I learned so much from it. My first question for you takes off from what you just said. One thing that's really cool about this book is that it reminds me structurally of Phil Garland's The Sound of Soul, in that it's similar from 1970, 71, in so far as, like her book, you begin with this long prehistory of the genre and the twists and turns, as you say, that it takes through the 70s and beyond. And then you follow that with a series of discrete profiles of individual artists. So Terry Collier is there, Linda Lewis, and others. And my question is just about the process through which you composed the book. Did you start with those individual artist profiles like Collier's, or did you start with the long history, or how did you do it?
Well, first, Phil Garland, I mean, her book was so important in writing this book, and basically kind of my thinking in how I was going to even approach it. I find that book just so, I mean, it's so important. It's so I'm glad you mentioned it, because and it's that idea of trying to take this huge thing like soul and trying to make it something you can distill down to words is so difficult. So being able to look at her book and being able to say, like, okay, she took something huge like this, I can do it too, because I'm just taking it like a little tiny bit. So I appreciate you mentioning that. So, I think I started with an idea of which artist were going to be in the book. But that kind of fell by the wayside as I started writing the book. This was my very first time writing a book, so I had big plans that quickly fell apart as soon as I sat down to write, and fell apart even more as soon as the editor got his hands on it. He's like, "Are you sure you want to do this?" And I thank him every day for it, because yeah, it was nice to have somebody from the outside come and look and say, "Hey, you're on the right track, but let's try to think about this a little bit." I think for me, the real kind of impetus for the book was during 2020, much like all of us assembled here, I lost my mind. And I decided to go back to school. It's like, well, I'm home anyway. How about a master's degree? It didn't work out. But what did happen is that I took a class with Maureen Mahan and started kind of playing around with this idea of what soul folk was. And I was like, it's a long article. Is that what it's going to end up being? Is it going to be a book? I don't know. But she helped me really kind of think about the ideas and whittle them down a little bit. And then I put it aside. I'd written the paper, I put it aside. I got a press release about an artist, Cleveland Francis, who's mentioned in the book. And it was for his album, and the big, grabbing subject line was, soul folk, the inventor of the term soul folk. And I'm just like, but okay, I'm going to like, I'm into it. And so when I got his album, I was able to interview him, and that ended up being an article for Wax Poetics. And I was like, there's still so much more I want to say. Like, so I sent my proposal, and it's like, okay, his story's great, but where can I find kind of the intersections of his story and other stories? So I did kind of work with the idea of, here are these discrete artists, but they're in a similar vein. There's got to be some ways that they cross influences that they each had. There's, I find that, during the research, it was a lot of people selling their records out of their trunks. There was a lot of people who their first album isn't at all who they ended up becoming. And so that kind of led me to, it's like, well, okay, well, why can't they just be this genre? And then that leads into the history a little bit. Like, okay, you can't be this genre because we've decided, whoever the we is, the powers that be have decided that folk is this one thing. And so, yeah, I think I moved back and forth between the history and the artists as much as I could. But in putting together the final book, it made more sense to kind of arrange it that way. I had kind of set up at one point like I wanted it to be like a mixtape, but that didn't really work out. But yeah, I wanted to front load the history, I think, because I felt like readers really needed to understand that this didn't come out of nowhere. There was a lot that brought us to the place where you get an artist like Linda Lewis or Terry Collier.
That's great. That's great. Speaking of the Cleveland Francis moment, I was really struck by that, because that's one of the moments where you present an artist who himself uses the term, and in fact claims the term or reclaims the term. And you say that he does that maybe retrospectively, but he's talking about the music that he's recorded in the 60s and 70s. And he, I think you say, uses soul folk to make the point that Black artists could talk about political issues such as poverty in Vietnam that had theretofore been associated with white artists, right? Um, and and so you kind of give us these moments of some kind of definition, in some ways produced by the artist, in some ways offered by you, or certainly you give us elements of what soul folk is. It's constituted, for instance, by an impulse toward storytelling, toward freedom, community, intergeneric mixture, and you beautifully present this sort of array of characteristics. And yet I feel at the same time that you refuse to actually pin it down precisely, or codify it. So you're kind of playing the game of the genre series and also not. You're offering what I see as more of an exploration of the concept, a deep history, a meditation on it. And so I guess my question is twofold. First, does that even strike you as an accurate assessment of what you've done? And then if so, could you say a little bit about why that approach made sense to you?
Yeah, I did kind of resist definition. And I, I did feel, okay, this is a book about genre, so you're supposed to explain this genre. But part of the difficulty for the artist in that genre is that at the time no one could explain it, and that's why they were sidelined, so many of them, because it didn't fit nicely into slots. And so while I believe there is some commonality between the artists and the kind of work they're producing, I still think that one of the beautiful things about soul folk as a genre is that it's resistant to being classified. And I feel like that resistance is part of its power. And so while I very generally do agree with soul folk as a term, and an easy way to kind of describe the music, I think the way to best honor the music is actually to push against the idea that it is actually a genre. Because you hear some songs and it's like, oh, that's, you can hear the jazz influence in that, or some others and you hear like calypso music, and others you hear rock, but there's a certain underlying sound there that does connect them, but they resisted the idea that they were one thing. They resisted the idea that they had to fit into these little easy boxes. And I fully admit that, that's a very odd approach for a series that ostensibly is supposed to really pin down these genres. But this isn't one that you can't really do that with, because it flattens it to define it in a way. But I recognize that it has to be defined. At least we all need to be speaking the same language in some ways when we talk about the music. So I did struggle with that actually a lot. And in many of the rewrites, it was kind of circling around that idea. Can I pin down what the definition of this is? And, kind of going back to Phil Garland with her trying to define soul. And I mean, you've written a book about soul. It's so much more about feeling than definition. You know it when you hear it. It's like pornography, right? It's like, you know it when you see it, like but yeah, you're hearing soul folk, not necessarily because of how it sounds, but because of how it makes you feel and how the artist is giving you their feelings through the music. I think it's so much more of a feeling than a collection of words that describe the music. And I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, beautifully answers the question. Yeah. And I think one thing that you're saying is that the project aims to create a sort of more capacious home, or even like a kind of village for these artists who otherwise didn't have a place. It was too easy to kind of marginalize or obscure them because they didn't have the kind of space that you've provided. But it is nonetheless a porous, kind of living, breathing space, as you said, is as much about feeling as it is about sound. Yeah. I have just a couple more questions, and this one grows out of something else that you write in the intro, where you say that contra Vernon Gibbs, who is writing in 75 about this like new genre or subgenre called soul folk, it has never really been a new development. Soul folk, as you say, has always been with us. And what that made me wonder, particularly kind of in this moment of reclaiming or excavating the Black roots of country, for instance, and other genres, is whether one implicit argument of this book is that folk music is Black music, and that perhaps the wrong color springs to the minds of too many people when one envisions American roots music. Do you think that's one thing that you're implicitly here? Yeah,
absolutely. I think that the more I read about folk and the more I listened, and there is such a connection. It's music of the people. So how can music of the people be exclusionary? I mean, we're also the people. And I think that has gotten lost in the idea of kind of breaking things down into genre. That some music is for these people and some music is for these people, when at its root, like, I think that all music is really for people. But yeah, I think that kind of, I read Francesca Royster's book, and kind of that idea of, we've always been in this genre. This is nothing new. I think I considered the book not to be a kind of like, see, we're, this is Black music too, and we do this too, more than just kind of shining a light on what's already there. I don't need to prove it. It exists, like, so I really, and I view that as my job, as the kind of writing I like to do, and the kind of writer that I hope to be, is to shine those lights. I take it as a really big honor and a privilege that I get to tell these stories, specifically stories about Black people, specifically stories about people who have come to this country and done so much and really, shaped the sound of America's music. And there's so many names that, we've written very lightly. And so they are always threatening to be erased. And I see that the work that I do is to make sure that those names don't get erased, to make sure that we still remember that we come from a long chain of things. Nothing just appears. And so while we'll never be able to know everyone and everything, who was the first to do that, or who did this before, we do know that we've always been there. And yeah, that's part of, I think, both why I wanted to really accurately, as much as I could, tell the history of the music, because I did want to point out, like, we have been here, we've stayed here, we've always been here. The difference is now we're saying you cannot ignore us. And yeah, so the history has always been super important to me, because I consider it like part of my job to make sure that those names get remembered in some way.
I have one more question based on that. And I really love the image of the names that have been written too lightly and are always at risk of being erased. I'm wondering if there was any artist, as you were writing the book, in addition to Collier, who you found yourself falling in love with, an artist who surprised you, and who you would like to highlight before I turn the floor over to other questions.
Yes. I mean, some of these artists, I mean, Bill Withers, of course, like I've always loved Bill Withers, but oddly, I didn't think I was going to include him in this book. Because it's like, well, he's, R&B, he's pop. I don't know how he really fits into this until I started reading that there was a point in his career too where people were finding it very difficult to define him. And so it made me appreciate him in a different way, I think. And Eugene McDaniels, I think, was probably the person I left with the most. I had been listening to him before, but putting him in this context and learning more about his story, how hard he had to push back. And also, I think there was something really kind of remarkable about his kind of reinvention. His first albums were under Gene McDaniels, and it was really corny pop music. And then when he said, enough of this, I don't want to do this anymore, I want to be me. And he comes out with these albums under the name Eugene McDaniels instead. And I just a few years back, like finding out that was the same person was a pretty shocking thing. So the 100 pounds of clay guy, for real? Okay, so I guess, but it's because he had changed as a person because America had changed as a place, and you couldn't keep singing these same songs, both metaphorically and actually. You can't keep singing, these light, sweet songs when the world is on fire. Sometimes someone needs to report on the fire, and I think his willingness to always report on the fire was something that really endeared me to him. Just like I loved how he was not afraid. He stepped into it so fearlessly. And I think that was, he knew it was changing. It was going to change his career. He knew that maybe people weren't going to like it. He didn't know he was going to end up on the president's enemies list or whatever, but, he still knew he was causing some trouble. And yeah, I just his willingness to not change, I think is something that was really impressive to me.
It's great. Eric, do you want to?
Sure thing. Thanks for getting us started in so many excellent directions. And I know from the questions that have come in that we have a few more places to go. So, but I'll encourage folks who are attending live to send me some more comments as well. There is time. So, Alex, do you want to get us started?
Sure. First off, Ashawnta, I'm really looking forward to reading your book. There's a bunch of names of folks I need to bone up on. I was really struck by your anecdote early on about how you discovered Terry Collier through Uncle, because I discovered Terry Collier through a Beth Orton duet, which made me I guess I have two kind of related questions about Britishness. One, like, what is the relationship that British listeners have to this music? And also, two, Linda Lewis was someone I was not familiar with, who I gather is English. But I was thinking about like Labi Siffre or Joan Armatrading. Jody Rosen brought up Sade in the chat. I'm curious, like, if Black British people are claiming this genre for themselves and what that means, because I think maybe this is just kind of ugly American of me, but I tend to think of soul and folk as like quintessentially quote unquote American genres, but of course they're not. So I'm curious, like, I guess first off, what do English or British listeners make of this music historically? And then secondarily, how do Black British artists take up this genre?
So in terms of Terry Collier, he quit music for a while because he wasn't really making money on it, and his daughter needed some medical care, so he went into computer programming for a while. And I think he was discovered, rediscovered the way that most of us kind of discover new things, crate digging. And so, that's you get that uncle sample, and then you get, those beautiful duets with Beth Orton, and he just his resurgence kind of came because of Britain. And I think it fits in with the history of kind of British people and their appreciation of American soul, the whole Northern soul movement, people whose careers were, I don't want to say over in America, but certainly in a much smaller way in America than they may have been at their height. They go to Britain and they're like, I can't believe you're here. So I think there's just always been that kind of appreciation. And not so much in any of my research had I found that they were really, though, claiming it as something, particularly British. No, I didn't find that. And I mean, Linda Lewis is kind of an interesting example because, she's very, very British, but I do think that the music that she was doing, it did have that kind of, there was something kind of American about it in a lot of ways. And I think that probably came from her personal exposure to music from very young. And then the people that she found herself surrounded by. I think that probably guided her a little bit. But nothing I found kind of really showed that it was something that, they were claiming as, like, oh, we've got this style of music. Nothing that I really.
Okay. Carl, why don't you come on in?
Sure. Thanks so much for this. This is really interesting. I guess this is getting into partly because I haven't read the book yet, and so partly it's just to flesh out some of the stuff there. With talking about genealogy and talking about definitions and boundaries that you're drawing, as much as we might not want to draw them rigidly. I wonder if there's a distinction that you're making between what's soul folk and what's folk music made by Black people historically. Particularly thinking about like the 40s, 50s, like the pre-folk revival period, but what was leading to the folk revival, where people like Odetta and Josh White, and even to some degree like Harry Belafonte and Paul Robeson, obviously they're all precursors, at least in some way, to something called soul folk. But like, when we're talking about soul folk, are we talking about something in a period that's sort of post the invention of soul music as such? Like, does it have to be in that kind of historical bracket?
So I covered it a little bit in the book because there are obviously, like you mentioned, other examples of Black people doing folk music. And so one point that I hope I made in the book is that just because it's a Black person doing folk music doesn't make it soul folk. Right. So, and Odetta is actually one who's really interesting because she has a soul folk album, but she's not a soul folk artist. Yeah, I do.
Which album is that? I should recognize immediately, but
Odetta Sings 1960. Hold on, I can tell you in 1 second. It's oh, of course I'm not finding it.
It's okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, it's she has an album from, I want to say, late 60s, early 70s, and it's kind of rock, soul, funk. It's pretty good, and you can see that she's trying to find her way into this kind of amorphous genre. Oh, I've lost my train of thought. But I think that one of the strongest examples of the difference is the Newport Folk Festival and what they expected from the musicians, the Black musicians, versus what the Black musicians were actually doing. You know, they're like, why are you playing this electric guitar? Sit on this hay bale and strum out some tunes. They're like, no, that's not actually. And I think it goes back to the idea of it not necessarily being a sound, but a feeling. And so while there are some songs, I think, that kind of hint at it early on. There is a difference, and that pivot point, I can't say it's for certain, but it was probably the death of Dr. King, because you know, it makes you realize that, and I'm speaking for these artists, so I don't actually know, except in the case of Cleveland Francis, I do know because I asked him, and yeah, he said that was a really pivotal moment for him. The idea that your music has something to say, and that's your weapon, that's your tool. And when something so tragic and earth-shattering happens like that, I think that that's the kind of before and after, even. You know, is just the idea that you're part of this larger community, and the tool that you're going to use is your music. So I think that that's probably one of the big dividing points. And I don't want to necessarily get too much into the idea of like, this sounds white, but also those earlier folk artists who then like kind of shifted to soul folk, you can hear the difference in the audience they're trying to appeal to. I think you can really hear those differences, where the music is definitely trying to reach out to a broader audience versus I'm speaking to a group in particular.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
All right. Jody Rosen?
Hey, thank you for this talk. It's great, very interesting, and I'm super excited to read the book. And I feel like some of the question that I kind of spewed out here was answered by your last response, because I get into a little bit of the wondering about antecedents, and you kind of addressed that in your last answer. But I'll just kind of read a little bit about what I wrote. Basically, I was wondering, and also it occurs to me, I might be wrong about this, and I didn't get a chance to Google, but I think Johnny Nash is another interesting figure who had an album called Soul Folk or Folk Soul or something like that, right? So, and he figures interestingly with the kind of Black British diasporic thing we were talking about, with the, Caribbean roots and questions. So that, just making note of that. But that's not what I wrote down. What I wrote down is, I wonder what role the presence of acoustic guitar, plain and simple, plays in what we would call soul folk. Like Bill Withers is often deemed folk because he's a singer-songwriter who performed confessional songs, often accompanying himself on acoustic. And then I said, obviously, Withers songs are very, very blues-inflected, which maybe thickens the plot in genre terms. I said, also, is a song like Al Green's Simply Beautiful, aka the greatest song ever, soul folk? It's very clearly a solo electric, I think, guitar song, which Willie Mitchell then went to town on. But like, if you've seen, like, there's videos of Green playing that song solo with just, I think, an electric, and that performance definitely codes as something other. I mean, it's Al Green, so it's soul. Don't get me wrong, it's gospel, it's everything, but it's anyway. And then I said, also, here's the antecedents part. To the extent that a guitar is a linchpin of soul folk, should we hear groups like the Mills Brothers or the Ink Spots as soul folk progenitors? And maybe you answered that with your question about with your answer about where you're sort of drawing the line historically and generically. But whatever, that was the question I wrote.
What's interesting though is you know, I do think about the acoustic guitar as being important in the idea of folk at large, and I think that's partly because of like the, you know, the imagination of folk, right? You kind of envision that person with a guitar. But with soul folk, I think, and this is not something I covered in the book, but it's something your question made me think about. I think that it's the beat that is more important than the guitar, because even like the very early examples that I talk about of you know, people like white listeners' first exposure to enslaved Black people playing their music. There's so much about like the dancing and the way that they are responding to the music. I think it's about the beat more than it's about the guitar. And I think for me, that kind of indefinable thing that makes you know you're listening to soul, I find that in the beat more than I would find that in the guitar. And so I wonder if, you know, soul folk musicians definitely were using the acoustic guitar in a lot of the same ways, but there is something rarely kind of funky about the music, and I think that has to do with the rhythm section more, and just even if that's just hand clapping or foot stomping, there's something about that that grounds the music in a way that the guitar alone doesn't. I'm not familiar with that Al Green that you mentioned. I'm gonna look it up after this, because I am very curious.
Yeah, wait. You're gonna like what you see. I'll drop a YouTube link in the chat for a performance that I had in mind. But you should definitely check out the recorded version too.
Okay.
Gotta do it. Gotta do it.
Oh, sorry.
Oh no, I was all set.
Okay. Would Gail Wall, do you want to join?
Yeah, I'm sorry, and my dog is barking. This is like the problem. Thank you so much for this. And I'm sorry I can't do my video right now, but I am here. I'm really enjoying this conversation. My question is about the word folk, like the folk part of soul folk. And basically my question is that so many times when I have had to reach for that word, it's so impossibly burdened. And I feel like you can only say the word folk if you put it under like erasure and say, oh, folk in quotations, or because of the ways that that word folk has a very, very specific history that you just alluded to, kind of white people on plantations listening to Black song and making sense of it. And so I'm wondering, can soul folk recuperate the word folk for us? Or what do you do? What do you think about the word folk? I mean, you got two really hard words, but for different reasons.
Yeah, I touched on it a little bit, because of the idea that, there is that Johnny Nash album, Soul Folk. There's Soul Folk in Action by the Staple Singers. There's Cleveland Francis using the term soul folk. And what I landed on is that folk is the people, it's us, but also that the idea of soul folk, I have a hyphen in mind for ease of copy editing, but it could also be just, kind of one word, that meaning like the people with soul, and the music that those people create. So when talking about like the Staple Singers, for example, their album Soul Folk in Action, that is actually how I read it, more than that being a soul folk album. They are the soul folk, not necessarily the music. So I think when in recuperating the term a bit, while I'm using it as a term for a genre, because that's kind of the confines of the book, I think I view it more as it being the people that, we are the soul folk. I say something in the book like the soul brothers and sisters who are celebrating us, celebrating Blackness, celebrating the music, and all the things that that means. So I think it can be recuperated in a sense, but reclaimed and kind of twisted in that it still just goes back to the people. Yeah, so I think that it's just this double meaning. Like, yes, it's a type of folk music, but also the soul folk are the people making that music.
Thank you so much.
Cool. Timothy Ann Burnside, come on down.
I'm here.
Hey.
Great. Hello. Super excited, like everyone else in this room, to be able to get into this. And I think, one of the things I'm always concerned with, I guess you could say, is, how people are interpreting and experiencing the histories that have been written thus far. And so, for example, what I'm hearing a lot of is like, I put in my question, Richie Havens, like, oh yeah, he wrote that one protest song, Freedom, right? Like that's the thing that people who may not have done the work that everyone in this room has done attach to him, and therefore labeled as activist music. And how we all see that Black music is often given an additional layer of labels. So that even with Odetta or someone else, often that, for example, activist label overshadows the folk label or the blue or whatever else may be. And, that's again why this book is so important, and why, as I mentioned, the work of so many people is so important. But I'm curious about whether or not there's any investigation of that kind of idea. Like, you may not think of someone like this because they've been kind of labeled this way. And that's not a mislabel. That is a moment of music as protest, as activism, of course. But that's, I think, what is so different about working with writing about these moments of Black music in transition, if you will, that often multiple layers of labels do apply. So how do we hold on to all of them in different ways, or add something like this to the narrative that hasn't been discussed as much? Sorry if that's a
No.
thing.
I'm glad that you mentioned Richie Havens, because when I first started this, I was for sure that Richie Havens was going to take up a huge chunk of it. And as it turned out, he's barely mentioned. Not because I don't necessarily think that he isn't soul folk, but because I don't know. A lot of his music, as I was listening and kind of trying to group music together, it some of it fell out of the boundaries. It's, there has to be a cutoff at some point. However, the my daddy-daughter dance at my wedding was to a Richie Havens song. Because that song in particular is soul folk to me, because it is emotional. It is a song that is talking about a very common human experience, a father loving their child, and what that means, and seeing the world through your child's eyes. And that right there is why I just keep going back to the idea that this is music for and of the people, because he's writing this song. Well, he didn't write this song, but he performed this song that is so relatable to anyone who's ever, been a child or someone who's been a parent. That's the human condition. I think, maybe sometimes we view protest as out of the human condition, so it feels like it's very separate. But that's part of it too, and I think maybe that's why sometimes some of the protest music, some people get kind of shunted off into, oh, that's protest music, without realizing that that is part of the experience too. And so many of the Black artists that, kind of shifted even their own thinking about what folk music was, it's partly because of the politics of the day. So they don't view it as any different. They view that as another facet of their personality. I don't know how we get the listener to, you know, to understand that all of that is part of being a person in the world, understanding the world around you, speaking to the world around you. So I don't know, for someone like Richie Havens, he's got that iconic moment. And that's, you know, of course I mentioned that, you know, that's how people know him. A lot of people know him, but I know him as this guy that wrote or performed a really sweet song about a father and a child. And that was the last song I've ever danced to with my dad to. And for me, that's the soul folk.
Wait, what's the song?
Yeah.
Wonder Child.
Oh, okay. That's really nice. It's a special, much more special than my moment, which is that I just smoked pot with him one time when I was like 16. So, yeah, and I love Guthrie at a different occasion. Those are the I was literally 16 years old. So who knew that like I would go on to like think about him in this very different way professionally. So yeah, thank you for all of that. And
yeah, I don't know if that even answered your question.
No, it's okay. I'm just thinking about like what you were saying, where it's like sometimes moments overshadow someone's entire legacy. And how do we investigate all of that and present all of it, even though none of it's incorrect, it's all true, right? So, you know, like in my world, if I only have 125 words to tell someone's story, like what rises to the surface, and you don't have a chance to have all that nuanced conversation and that nuanced narrative. And what we don't want is for any of these artists, of course, to be seen through only one lens. And so this, I think, idea of soul folk creates another lens through which to see artists, because even if it is protest music, it's still something else. You know, there are all of these things happening at once. And so I think that hopefully this project and this work starts to help people see that, like, yeah, you can actually get into this from multiple different perspectives and they can all be correct. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the folks on the call is a genre specialist and Eugene McDaniels fan, so I'm roping him in here for a moment. Charlie Cronengold.
Hello, everybody. This sounds great. I'm really looking forward to this book, and I did click on the playlist, which obviously impressed me a lot, as it would have impressed anybody who looked at it. So I hope you're all connecting with that. And yeah, I mean, just thinking about Eugene McDaniels, Ashawnta, you put it perfectly. I mean, how does this clean-cut 100 pounds of clay guy in 1965 turn into Headless Heroes of the Apocalypse and Natural Juices? And like, the only thing I would add is that this is also the person Roberta Flack brings back into prominence as a producer, songwriter, collaborator, precisely for his like soul folk thoughtfulness. And at some risk to her own career, because, you know, they worked really slowly in the studio together, and Atlantic Records, like, she was like in trouble for like being 6 months late on, you know, that Feel Like Making Love album, because she was collaborating with Eugene McDaniels. And, you know, so anyway, can I ask my sort of semi-related question? If that's okay, Eric, and Ashawnta, just because the Roberta Flack thing makes me think about this, that, you know, obviously you can't talk about everybody. And if you're trying to identify key figures in soul folk, you know, you got to pick and choose. But one of the things that this project is teaching me already, just based on your playlist and what you're saying today, and, you know, how you frame the book, is how much this soul folk idea bleeds back into soul. You know, it's soul's other subgenres, and soul as kind of an umbrella genre. And, you know, when you think about, you know, Roberta Flack covering Leonard Cohen songs, when you think about the kinds of sounds that Jody was talking about, the acoustic guitar, I mean, I think about, why does Ernie Isley need to run and buy an acoustic 12-string guitar? And then when he does, he writes Harvest for the World, which is this kind of, you gotta say now, soul folk influenced soul hit, right? And why do gospel singers include songs by their kids that they wrote at folk singing circle camps, in the 70s and so on. I mean, a lot of the sort of things that I'm now kind of putting together in my mind in soul music proper in the 70s, and a lot of it's kind of related genres like gospel and even soul jazz and so on, are really going to be better understood by thinking of them in terms of the kind of soul folk moment that they include. So I'm just wondering, like, obviously the scope of the book doesn't permit you to do this, but can you talk a little bit about like how this focus on soul folk has kind of influenced your listening to soul music, like your understanding of soul as a genre?
Yeah. Growing up, both of my parents are from Louisiana, both outside of New Orleans. My dad in a really rural place. But one thing that has always been true is that there was always a lot of music in my house. A couple of my uncles were musicians, and some of my cousins and my brother. And so music and the idea that music is, it's not just this one thing, right? So in our house, we were always listening to gospel, to R&B, to jazz, to country, and the kind of connecting thing was all of that music had soul. It wasn't necessarily all soul music, but it all had soul. And so I think what it made me feel growing up was that music is a feeling as much as it's a sound. And wherever you can get that feeling from, go find it and find more like it all the time. And so for me, writing this book, it definitely made me think about gospel and how even I, as a non-believer, the idea of gospel music being foundational to my idea of what soul is undeniable. It doesn't have to be that I believe it, but I believe that they believe it. And so there's something really powerful about hearing someone be very vulnerable and honest and truthful. So in that way, I was definitely connecting gospel to folk because especially it's soul folk. And in thinking about protest music and how, these civil rights organizations were kind of reworking folk songs to make them into protest songs, or reworking soul songs, Get Your Rights Jack instead of Hit the Road Jack, things like that. And just, it was all around. So for me, I think it made me kind of, I don't know, want to chase that feeling more. I have a lot of music in my life, a lot of records, a lot of instruments are around me right now, but it's more than that. Like, I want to continue to chase those feelings, and because I write about music and I don't really do music, I sometimes worry that I'm not capturing the feeling enough. But I don't know. It's such a difficult question. But I think that it's made me a different kind of listener for sure. And it's made me, think about less about what I'm hearing and more about what I'm feeling. And I felt like I was always that way, but I'm even more so that way now. Because of this music, because it's so much more of a feeling than a sound. I think it's definitely made me kind of cling to the feeling of things a little bit more. And I'm sure that does not answer your question at all. But another thing,
No,
though,
it does.
At the end of the book, because I realized that there's so many people that I could have mentioned and didn't, or, one of the things is that it is a it's not a dead genre. It's one that's still going on. They're still making this music. And so what I'm saying in the book is that, yes, I've definitely left some names out, but it's a story that I hope we're all going to write together, that we'll all keep filling in these names and that we'll all keep adding to the story of it, because it's, I'm sure I missed some stuff in the beginning. I missed some stuff in the middle. There's stuff we don't even know that's happening right now. So yeah, I want us all to kind of think about this music as a living thing and all kind of add to the idea of like, what is the soul folk? What is it? Or who are the soul folk, So I kind of cheated a little by admitting in the book that I understood it wasn't complete. But I want everyone to just keep finding that feeling of discovery.
In a somewhat related note, Mark Engelson, you had a very specific question along these lines. Do you want to just throw it in here?
Yeah, I'd be interested in hearing who you think is doing soul folk today.
So Gray Reverend is somebody I really enjoy. Sunny War, Michael Kiwanuka, Allison Russell. And I think too, it gets into some of those complications of genre because, a lot of those artists kind of cross lines. Is it country? Is it roots? Is it soul? And that's kind of the beauty of soul folk too, because when you can't quite reach for what you're like, I know that this must be something. I know that this sound must be something. That's really where I think that, soul folk lies, in the kind of intersections of music. So I think that those artists are definitely, keeping it alive. If not throughout their whole albums, but there's definitely like pieces of it, different songs for sure.
I love the way you're encouraging us to basically get a certain feeling in our heads and then just keep finding more things like it got lodged in you as a epistemology or something, and then off to the races forevermore. Elena, you had a question.
Hi, thank you so much for the book and for this conversation. I think it's interesting how your work makes us think wider about what belongs in the genre. And I wondered, with your book, what can we do with how music critic describe the genre, maybe your genre or any genre in general, like at the very early moment? Like because the 60s, I think, was Richie Havens, and also the example I had in the note is Elaine Brown, who was her first album, Size the Time, was really, critics couldn't place it at all, and it was both called soul and folk and classical and jazz, and a lot of hyphenation happened for that reason, because these recordings kind of didn't fit at the time in any particular genre. So I wonder, how did you include those early descriptions of soul folk records in your research? How did you deal with music critics when they were thinking about the genre?
Yeah, I did include some quotes from critics who were grappling with the idea of it. And one of the things that I noticed is, a lot of the critics who couldn't understand it kind of like, well, there's nothing to understand, whatever. And kind of hoped it would all sort itself out, maybe. But I think that that's also less about the music and more about how homogenous music criticism was during the time that a lot of this music was being made. I think that a lot of critics of that time maybe didn't understand that not everything was necessarily made for them. And that didn't make it bad or something that, you know, you can't classify, it just made it something very different. And I think that's still an issue, less so about, you know, critics all being kind of, you know, old white men, you know, now, but more about the idea that we're so, not this group, but lots of people are very siloed when it comes to their music. You can listen to only what you want to listen to forever and ever and ever and never hear anything different than that. And if you do hear something different from that and it's not made for you, there is sometimes this real hesitancy to accept it. And that's more from listeners than critics. But I think that the idea of reaching for genre to explain how to listen to the music is, I mean, I guess this makes my whole book kind of fall apart, but I don't necessarily think that that's how music should be. You know, I recognize that this is a series about genre and that I wrote a book about a genre, but I also think, you know, as I mentioned earlier, that some of the problem is that everything, you know, people want to contain so much and not just let things be free. I think, you know, usually, I think we'll look back on a lot of new music and begin to, you know, put it into some kind of context later. I mean, like with yacht rock, you know, like how, you know, that's a, you know, how that became, you know, a genre after the fact. So I think that that's probably going to happen with a lot of this music, that people are having a really hard time defining, or maybe we'll just be comfortable with the idea that not every single kind of music can be defined. And that's okay.
Okay, thank you.
All right, to wrap up for tonight, we're going to bring Emily Lordi back for one final important question.
Thank you. This has been so great. Thank you so much. My question regards your forthcoming project, Move On Up, the history of Black-owned record labels, due out from Norton in 2027. I just would love to hear a little bit more about the origins of that project and maybe also its relationship to this one, because while I can see some continuous themes through both, you know, the idea of Black power and autonomy and freedom, community, it also seems like that book might be a hard pivot away from the feeling of Black music toward the business of Black music. So can you just talk a little bit about their relationship?
Yeah. So I think because of kind of just the way I write, I think it's going to be really hard for me to avoid the feeling, because I do want to explore each of these labels by their output, not necessarily you know, the business of them, because some of them were terrible businesses, but made really good music. So I think I want to, you know, hold on to that as much as I can. And there definitely are connections. I think the whole, you know, one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that so many of these soul folk artists were real DIY. Nobody was wanting to sign them or sell their records. So I'm just going to put a bunch of records in my trunk, and after the show, everybody come out to my trunk and buy a record. That's the spirit of Black-owned record labels as well too. The idea of, like, you know, what is it, James Brown says, open up the door and I'll get it myself. Like, that's the whole idea, that they are just like, we're just going to do it. You're not going to let us be ourselves, so we're just going to do it. And I think that idea, I mean, it starts with the very first one with Black Swan Records, which is ostensibly where the book is going to start. I haven't really worked out the flow of it yet, but you know, and that was a response to the largely white music industry telling Black people who we were, and what they expected from us. And the pushback from that became Black Swan, and you can kind of see that attitude in a lot of the other labels. And I think, the idea of just being self-sufficient and autonomous and being able to make the work you want, that's soul too. And the connections between Black businesses that aren't necessarily record shop or record labels, but like beauty salons, record stores, just little general stores, those all were in some ways, there are examples of each of those kind of places becoming record labels because the Black community gathered there and they're like, well, what if we also press some records? So it also is about community in a way that I think it's less about business and more about community. And at least I hope that that's, where, I hope that that's the story I'm going to tell with it.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Ashawnta. Thank you, Emily, for this great conversation. I'll wrap up simply by reminding everyone to come back in January 7th because there aren't many chances to learn as much as we need to learn about MF Doom. And S.H. Fernando Jr. has written the book, The Chronicles of Doom, and we'll be hearing about his work unraveling rap's masked iconoclast. So happy New Year, everybody, and we'll see you again in 2025. Thanks.